Greetings, everyone. This is Nick Estes here today with a special episode on the case of Leonard Peltier, his continued imprisonment. He's going on 49 years or almost half a century of being imprisoned for a crime that he claims, he's maintained his innocence since the day that he was incarcerated. But I wanted, in honor of his birthday, it's his birthday week that we're recording this. I wanted to sort of go over some facts of his case and talk a little bit more in detail about some of the sort of myths and misinformation that exists out there. Specifically, I want to talk about my own personal role in the Leonard Peltier campaign, but also confronting certain questions that I've had over the years in supporting him, but also questions that have been posed to me by other activists. And so this one is a kind of a doozy. It's a very fact-heavy case. I'm going to be referencing several key documents, some of which I'm going to be reading in whole, just so that we can get a better understanding of the case. And I also recommend that viewers and listeners check out our archive on Leonard Peltier. We've done lots of interviews, so I'm going to be referencing some of that. We'll also, put in a link to an article that I wrote for Jacobin, which lays out the details of the case, kind of very fact-based details, timeline of events, just so that you understand, because we're coming up on the tail end of the last, remaining months of the Biden presidency. And typically at the end of a presidency, clemency pardons are granted to folks. Biden has claimed that he would not be beholden to the sort of like timeline of granting he would be doing like rolling pardons and clemencies, which we haven't really seen. So we're expecting sort of an increase now that he is no longer the Democratic nominee. And this is the last couple of months of his 4-year presidency. But I want to give some contextual background, but then also think about this larger question of the FBI and the sort of state's narrative that tie not only Leonard Peltier to the killing of these 2 FBI agents, but also attempts that have been made within the last 3 decades to link him to the murder of his friend and fellow, comrade in arms, so to speak, Anna Mae Aquash or Anna Mae Pictou-Aquash. So I first got involved in the campaign to free Leonard Peltier in 2013. At the time, the International Leonard Peltier Defense Committee was headquartered in Albuquerque, New Mexico, where I was going to graduate school. It's also around this time that we founded the Red Nation, almost 10 years ago. That was in November of 2014. There were annual demonstrations for Peltier's freedom at the federal courthouse. As the administration of Barack Obama wound down, the push for a presidential clemency increased. And to top it off, the water protector movement at Standing Rock against the construction of the Dakota Access Pipeline presented a rare opportunity to discuss Peltier's case with a national audience and how it impacted American Indian rights in the United States. I can't recall a time before 2016 having an international platform and a receptive audience to what are mostly marginalized and easily dismissed, quote unquote, Indigenous stories in the corporate press. The clemency campaign was invigorating, to say the least. It connected the experiences of water protectors at Standing Rock to the previous generation of Red Power activists, many of whom, by then elders, also made pilgrimages to the Ochete Chacon camps at the confluence of the Cannonball and Missouri rivers. There were also parallels with how the police responded to the water protectors as they did to the Red Power movement. In particular, the swift and violent crackdown against water protectors created a new generation of Indigenous political prisoners, opening the eyes of many across the world to the reality that the Indian Wars and American Indian people in general were not some ancient relics of a lamentable and tragic past. Those struggles were and are very much animating our present realities. Leonard Peltier's case and continued persecution epitomize that truth. After I left the Standing Rock camps for the last time in late November, I went to Washington, D.C. to petition members of Congress for Leonard Peltier's release. On the morning of December 9th, I awoke to the tragic news of Peltier's son, Oaxaca Paul Shields, had passed away in the hotel room next to me. He died fighting for the freedom of a father whom he came to know only through the walls of a prison. Waha, as he was called, Waha's death, however, didn't elicit sympathy from the very people with the power to release his father. The reactions to our lobbying efforts were cold. Fear had gripped our supposed elected congressional allies as the presidency of Donald Trump loomed large. How cruel, I thought. Native faces are great for photo ops and trotting us out every 4 years for a presidential election, but they couldn't see us as we stood before them in those final months or those final days of December. The continued incarceration of Leonard Peltier represents the international struggle of many Indigenous and non-Indigenous families who have been torn apart by regimes of mass incarceration. Peltier himself was stolen away as a child and forced to attend boarding school, and from him were stripped his culture, his language, and his own familial connections to his relatives, including his parents. Like the administrations preceding him, and the one that came after him, Obama and his ruling party were unwilling and unable to break that intergenerational cycle of violence against our relatives by refusing to grant clemency or justice to Leonard Peltier. And nearly half a century of international support for his freedom has come from all corners, including renowned international human rights activists, heads of state, and even former federal prosecutors who were responsible for putting and keeping Leonard Peltier in jail, as well as an FBI agent close to his case. And of course, the most vociferous supporters are Native people themselves. Go to Pine Ridge Reservation. The Oglalas who were alive during the shootout that left 2 FBI agents, Ronald Williams and Jack Kohler, and one AIM activist, Joe Stuntz, dead, remember those days of terror as if they happened last week. The collective punishment of the American Indian movement by the FBI, the Bureau of Indian Affairs Police, and a vigilante goon squad, backed by an authoritarian tribal president, created a toxic atmosphere of violence on the reservation. A U.S. civil rights report called the bloody backlash following the 71-day liberation of Wounded Knee in 1973 by AIM and Oglalas a quote-unquote reign of terror. Beatings, rapes, and killings of AIM members and their supporters went unresolved. The FBI, charged with investigating major crimes on the reservation, had hundreds of agents in and out of the reservation during this period, more so than before the escalation of political violence. Yet, as is made clear by the many independent investigations by civil and human rights experts, the FBI's increased presence on the reservation did not curtail violence. Rather, the FBI's actions inflamed the violence by serving more as a political police force, staying true to their origins as an organization tasked with crushing communist movements in the first half of the 20th century, and radical groups like the Black Panthers, Chicano organizations, and the American Indian movements in the latter half of the 20th century. This flies in the face of the FBI's own mythology that, are perpetuated in Hollywood movies like The Killers of the Flower Moon or others that, put the FBI as sort of saviors of Native people. And it's also why an all-white jury concluded when it found Leonard Peltier's co-defendants, Bob Robidoux and Dino Butler, not guilty for reasons of self-defense in the killing of the FBI agents in June of 1975. They considered the prevailing factors and atmosphere of violence that led up to that particular shootout. Federal investigators have never probed the murder of Joe Stuntz, who also died that day, nor Buddy Lamont or Frank Clearwater, who were also killed by federal bullets during Wounded Knee, or the other reported deaths of American Indians who were killed during the Reign of Terror. So with the support from generations of legal and human rights experts who have noted the discrepancies in Leonard Peltier's case, why is he still in prison? During my own, work on Leonard Peltier's clemency campaign, I encountered firsthand the widespread efforts to keep him in prison. Retired FBI agent Colleen Rowley summarized it best in her 2022 letter to Joe Biden calling for Peltier's clemency. She writes, "Retribution seems to have emerged as the primary, if not sole reason for continuing what looks like from the outside to have become an emotion-driven, quote-unquote, FBI family vendetta." Here she refers to a line in FBI Director Chris Wray's letter on behalf of retired FBI agents, whom he called, quote, the entire FBI family. Wray invoked that exact phrase in his letter to Bureau of Prisons for Peltier's parole hearing last June, who he called a quote-unquote ruthless murderer who has demonstrated an utter lack of remorse for his many crimes, end quote. Accompanying Wray's letter was another accusation made by South Dakota Attorney General Marty Jackley. In his letter arguing against Peltier's parole, Jackley cites testimony from Kamuk Nichols, who, it was later revealed, worked as a paid government informant and who, quote, implicated Peltier in ordering the murder of Anna Mae Pictou-Aquash as well. So not only was his refusal to claim any sort of role in killing of these two FBI agents grounds for keeping him in prison as a quote unquote, remorseless killer, but also he's being tied by the Attorney General of South Dakota to the killing of Anna Mae Aquash. And I think this is important because this is something that I have personally encountered as somebody who's advocated for Leonard Peltier's clemency and release and even talking about this case. So I want to get into a little bit of this history because it's important to understand, why or how we got to this point to this day. And also just as a personal kind of aside, when I started working on this campaign, this is one thing that was brought up endlessly that, Leonard Peltier was a killer of a Native woman. How could I, as a Native person who claims to be advocating for, Native and Indigenous feminisms, support somebody who was essentially a perpetrator of violence against Native women? And that was something that I took, to heart. And I was like, well, I'm going to do an investigation. I'm going to do my own investigation. I'm going to, look at the facts of this particular case. What do I know? What do I think I know? And what exists out there? And this podcast episode is sort of an attempt to sort of just show what I've gathered over 10 years of just researching this particular case. And this is just a fraction of the documents that exist. And I'm going to read these because I think, as somebody, as a historian, I think it's important to stay true to our sources. But it's also important to sort of sit back and reflect on this kind of long period of violence that was directed against not only, incarcerating Leonard Peltier, that spilled over into, this intergenerational battle by his own family, that's broken apart his own family. His son literally died, trying to get him out of prison. But to try to understand why is there this, retribution against the American Indian movement, but also why keep Leonard Peltier in prison after everything that has been done. So just to give you some background, 4 homicide cases from 2004 to 2010 revealed details of the 1975 killing of Anna Mae Pictou-Aquash, who was then 30 and also a prominent member of the American Indian movement. According to the state's theory of the case, Theda Rose Nelson Clark, who was 51 at the time, accused Aquash of being a government informant. That was a year prior in 1974. The first accusation, according to the testimony that has been gathered, the interviews that have been published with people who witnessed this, the first person to make this public accusation was Theda Rose Nelson Clark at a gathering in Farmington in 1974. So with 2 young men, John Graham and Arlo Lookencloud, both of whom were 21 years old at the time, Clark took Aquash from Denver, Colorado to South Dakota in late November 1975, where on Clark's order, Aquash was murdered days later. An April 28, 1976 FBI teletype reveals that the Denver FBI had learned about Aquash's killing from a Denver informant on December 19th, 1975. That's literally almost a week after in the state's timeline of events that she was murdered. So the Denver FBI informant told the FBI that she was murdered by, quote, 3 Indian members of AIM, all of Denver, Colorado, identified as redacted, comma, redacted, comma, and redacted, end quote. Despite this knowledge of her murder, Aquash's body wasn't found until February 24th, 1976. An autopsy the following day in Pine Ridge didn't identify her or discover that she had been shot in the head, but ruled she died of exposure. Aquash was buried on March 2nd, 1976, and her amputated hands were sent to an FBI crime lab in Washington, D.C., where her fingerprints were identified on March 3rd. At the behest of her family and lawyers working for the American Indian movement, a second autopsy was authorized, finding a bullet near her left temple. So just to kind of play this back a little bit, for those of you who might have missed some of these key details, she was taken from Colorado to South Dakota at the end of November. And according to the state's theory of the case, when she was there in Rapid City, and then later, went to, I think they claim that she went to the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation. She was murdered at the hands of these 3 individuals who were named. A week after this murder allegedly took place, according to this timeline, an FBI informant in Denver told the Denver FBI who had killed her, why they had killed her, where they had killed her, and all relevant information related to that murder. But nonetheless, even after she was identified in March 3rd, 1976, months later, the FBI within their teletypes and within their memorandum still referred to her as Anna Mae Aquash, aka deceased victim, CRI, crime on Indian reservation. But that was the heading. But then later in the lead paragraph, it described her as a quote unquote unidentified Indian female. So even after she had been identified, she was still referred to as an unidentified Indian female. Other references, even in the April teletype that I previously cited in 1976, it also identified her in various ways as unidentified female, unidentified girl, unidentified female Indian, and quote unquote unidentified victim. The Denver FBI office, however, still hadn't verified the validity of the informant's December 1975 report, although he knew of Aquash's murder from someone with direct knowledge. So this raises a whole lot of questions, right? And to kind of put this into a broader framework, I'm going to read specifically from a letter. I'm going to read the whole thing because I think it's important to have this letter read. And this comes from Hank Adams. And for those of you that don't know Hank Adams, we did a memorial episode on him. He died, several years ago in 2020. And this is a Facebook post that he wrote on December 14th, 2020. It was maybe a couple of weeks before he had passed away. And it was sort of a last will and testament of Hank Adams. And Hank Adams, if you don't know who he is, he was a preeminent Red Power activist. He was Red Power before AIM was Red Power. He went to the March on Washington with the Poor People's Campaign under Martin Luther King Jr. He had led a draft resistance for Native people in the Northwest for Native people to burn their draft cards, to refuse to participate in the U.S.'s imperial war in Vietnam. He was never a member of the American Indian movement. And in fact, he started an organization called Survival of American Indians that was in some ways very critical of a lot of AIM's tactics. But nonetheless, he was the author of the 1972 document, The Trail of Broken Treaties, which articulated a treaty platform for a new relationship between the United States government and American Indian nations that was premised on the principles of sovereignty and nation-to-nation relations that would restart a treaty-making process This became the foundational document for the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Hank Adams himself later went on to be critical of a lot of members of AIM for their tactics, not only those that were perceived as violent, but others, their kind of policy on their relations with, third world nations. That's a whole nother episode. But suffice it to say is this man was around. He lived this history. He had encyclopedic knowledge of these movements, and himself was, I wouldn't say he was objective, but he wasn't a sort of AIM acolyte, right? He was somebody who operated within that context at that particular time, but he wasn't necessarily somebody who would go out and just defend AIM at the drop of the hat. And in many ways, he criticized a lot of AIM's tactics, and also he criticized a lot of people that AIM recruited. AIM recruited a lot of pretendians, and this is a whole nother story, but I'm just trying to give this background on who he is and like why this kind of last one of his, final posts on Facebook is so important and so critical to this particular case. And I don't have time to get into every claim that he makes in this particular podcast. It's something that I do want to continue in a future podcast to kind of break apart some of these claims so that we get a thorough understanding of this particular timeline and this particular history. So he's writing, he's responding on December 14th, 2020. And this is a response to a 2016 APTN article, which is a Native news source in Canada, in which Assembly of First Nations Chief Perry Bellegarde apologizes to Anna Mae Aquash's family for the AFN, the Assembly of First Nations, kind of backing historically a clemency or retrial for Leonard Peltier. And this is relevant actually to this day because just before, around the time that, Leonard Peltier's parole, the ruling came down on his parole, which, was denied. The Assembly of First Nations actually rescinded its support entirely this last July for Leonard Peltier over these reasons that I'm going to get into right now. So this is relevant, and he kind of called it out at this particular time, kind of anticipating this backlash that was going to happen under Joe Biden's presidency. So he writes, intellectually dishonest hate-monger Paul Demain, who is a Native journalist who kind of broke this story back in the 1990s, has reignited his campaign to assure denial of any executive clemency to Leonard Peltier, who's 76, at any time before Leonard's next scheduled parole hearing in year 2024, which just happened, with a continued misuse and abuse of the December 1975 gunshot death of Anna Mae Pictou-Aquash and the unconscionable exploitation of Anna Mae Pictou-Aquash's children. Assembly of First Nations National Chief Perry Bellegarde makes the significant points in this 2016 article, in which the 1975 Aquash death became the center point in President Barack Obama's decision to deny clemency to Peltier. Quote, I regret that my statement caused some hurt and pain, and I apologize for the pain. I caused her, Denise Maloney Pictou, and her family, said Bellegarde. That wasn't my intent. And Denise Maloney Pictou is Anna Mae's daughter. Bellegarde said he still would like to see Peltier freed. He said the case is a separate issue from AIM's execution of Aquash. Quote, I called for that Peltier's release because there's an injustice there, said Bellegarde. So I will continue to advocate for that, end quote. Bellegarde said two previous AFN national chiefs had made the same call, which is also backed by Amnesty International and prominent individuals like the Dalai Lama. This is Hank Adams' words. Peltier was extradited from Canada to the United States in December of 1976. Warren Almond, Canada's Solicitor General at the time of Peltier's extradition, has since stated the FBI submitted false information to have Peltier extradited. Demain's posting of Aquash daughter Denise Maloney Pictou's December 12th, 2020 renewed accusations against Leonard Peltier and Demain's Hated AIM organization are the beginning of a campaign to assure that 2020 President-elect Joe Biden will not grant executive clemency to Leonard Peltier. In death and posthumously, Anna Mae had been made a sainted heroine. But between 1972 and November 14th, 1975, Anna Mae's ways were AIM's ways. AIM's ways, good and bad, were without qualification or reservation Anna Mae's ways, by choice. At NCAI, the National Congress of American Indian meeting in November 1975, American Indian Press Association's Richard LaCourse told me of his meeting with Dennis Banks, Leonard Peltier, Kamuk Banks, and Anna Mae just before his coming to Portland for NCAI. Anna Mae then had indicated no distress, nor given any indication that she was being held prisoner or against her will. On November 14th, 1975, the four AIM leaders, quote unquote, only broke apart because of an Ontario, Oregon stopping of their recreational vehicle by armed Oregon police. A couple days later, Leonard Peltier was transported through Frank's Landing, which at that time was kind of a historic site for the fish-ins in the 1960s and 1970s, from Portland in British Columbia by associates of mine, associates of Hank Adams, who did not inform me then of their activity. And I found out later in Washington, D.C. that this was Ramona Peterson, who was an activist at that particular time. She was the one who actually helped transport Peltier from the U.S. To the Canadian side. So she helped him cross the border, essentially. So she was with him at that time. And that's important because according to the state's theory of the case, he was giving orders to basically have Anna Mae Aquash assassinated and accusing her of of being an FBI informant, etc. But how could he, when he was like literally incommunicado with these associates of Hank Adams? That's the point he's trying to make here. So to continue on, quote, he spent the next month in the locale he was taken to and remained incommunicado with U.S. colleagues until later, at least until he traveled to Small Boys Camp in Alberta, Canada. That is where the RCMP and FBI picked up Leonard, long after Anna Mae Aquash's death in the second week of December of 1975. Memorandum in the FBI's Denver office, dated as early as December 19th, 1975, which I just quoted, disclosed Anna Mae Aquash had been killed, although the FBI would feign ignorance of the death and the corpse's identity for more than the next 3 months. The December 1975 memos identified the killers as, quote, John Boy Graham, Arlo Looking Cloud, and Theda Nelson Clark, although none of the three were indicted through the next 28 years. And in fact, as a side note, Theda Nelson Clark never stood trial and was never formally, charged with these murders. To continue on with Adams' post, the Looking Cloud trial was held in December of 2004, Graham's in 2010, lapses of 29 and 35 years, respectively. Theda Nelson, a likely FBI informant in December of 1975, on mental competency findings, did not go to trial. Clark died at age 87 in 2011. That's a huge claim, by the way, something I don't really have time to get into here. Maybe in a future podcast episode, I'll do that. Or maybe I can post some links to some other audio that have been done by people who've actually researched that particular claim. To continue on, although a lead prosecutor opened the Leonard Peltier trial in Fargo, North Dakota on March 16th, 1977, declaring, quote unquote, AIM is not on trial, both AIM and Leonard Peltier were made the main defendants in the 2004 and 2010 trials for the killing of Anna Mae Aquash. If there was ever a case where all parties, prosecution, defense, and all witnesses acted in friendly collusion to convict undefended and absent non-parties. First, Leonard Peltier. Second, the American Indian Movement. The Looking Cloud and Graham trials were such cases. The fodder for the trial's conspiratorial claptrap largely was wrung from the minds and imagination of Paul Demain in his relentless vendetta against AIM leaders and most creatively against Leonard Peltier. Here's Paul Demain in his own words. In 2011, at the Native American Journalists Association, he gives uncritical praise to government informants infiltrating and disrupting Indigenous movements, calling them heroes.
I think our neighborhood snitch is what everyone needs, and we need to support him. That's the grandmother that calls up and says, my uncle is raping my granddaughter, and tells on him. And it's the person that calls in and says, there's a crack house over here that are killing our kids. Okay? We need snitches and rats, and they're my heroes.
Many of his unsubstantiated claims were rejected by author Stephen Hendricks when writing his 2007 book, The Unquiet Grave. Demain timelines for Anna Mae Pictou-Aquash have since focused on the AIM convention in New Mexico, the one I just mentioned, just prior to the Jumping Bull compound deaths of FBI agents on Pine Ridge on June 26, 1975, leading to the 1977 life sentence convictions of Peltier. The design is intended to prejudice considerations against any grant of parole of clemency for Peltier. Canada's Assembly of First Nations is correct in declaring the execution of Anna Mae Aquash and the pursuit of freedom for Leonard Peltier on compassionate and humanitarian grounds as separate issues. They are correct in continuing their support for executive clemency through both offices of both the Canadian Prime Minister and the U.S. President, which, of course, they've just rescinded, as I mentioned earlier, and continuing. With what satisfaction can President-elect Biden derive from sidestepping all humanitarian and compassionate considerations for Leonard Peltier through a first term deferring any favorable consideration to the scheduled parole hearing in 2024, which Peltier was denied? The Pardons Office of a bureaucratic and prejudiced Justice Department housing the FBI has already failed the last 4 presidents of the United States in this matter. Will retribution finally end if Leonard Peltier is still alive in 2024 and then 80 years old? Indians of Western Washington who transported Leonard Peltier to Canada on or about November 17th, 1975, and Indians of British Columbia who hosted and concealed him for the next month or until beyond when the FBI was first informed of Anna Mae Aquash's death and the identity of her killers can attest to Leonard Peltier's movements and communications that wholly absolve Leonard Peltier of any direct or indirect role in the December 1975 murder of Anna Mae Pictou-Aquash. So there's a lot there. Maybe what I'll do is I'll just have our producer, Sina, post this in the episode description so you can read for yourself his exact words. He's somebody who knew these people at this particular time. And there's a lot of inside knowledge. There's a lot to unpack there, but I wanted to just sort of present that, as one sort of piece of evidence. And I want to, lastly, I just want to just read one last quote. And this is from an August 6, 1998 letter from the Department of Justice. This is from Karen E. Schreier, who was the U.S. Attorney for District of South Dakota at the time, and she's writing the Chief Deputy District Attorney in the Second Judicial Circuit, Robert J. Whitley, to sort of describe the reasons why she's declining to prosecute or to continue forward with the charging out of these particular individuals who are accused of murdering Anna Mae Aquash. And it's quite interesting. I don't have time to get into everything. She makes this argument about whether Indians, because John Graham was technically considered an Indian of Canada. So too was Anna Mae Aquash. They weren't, American Indians federally recognized in that sense. So this kind of question about jurisdiction was one of the reasons. But towards the end of the letter, she makes an interesting claim, and I'll just read it. Another potential downside to federal prosecution of the case is that it may be seen as a cover-up. Over the years, numerous individuals have alleged that the victim, Anna Mae Aquash, was either killed by the FBI or was killed as a result of FBI actions. Prosecution of members of the American Indian movement for the homicide could be seen as an effort on the part of the federal government to hide the role of the FBI in Aquash's death. This is an admission by the DOJ that there are these, this perception out there that Anna Mae Aquash, that, or at least the FBI had some role in her murder. And as we know now, based on the documents that I just cited from the FBI informant, knowing in December of 1975 that she had been killed, who had killed her, and where she was killed, and by whom she was killed, they did have direct knowledge of her murder, but didn't do anything about it, and didn't, really charge anyone out until, as Hank Adams points out, until almost 30 years later, 3 decades later. So what happened in that interim? And I want to just point out, I'm not throwing around accusations. I'm just asking questions based on the documents, based on the sources that I've obtained. And I don't want to throw anyone under the rug in terms of saying that the feelings of her own family aren't valid in the sense of wanting justice for their mother, for their sister that was taken from them. Like, I think that's a totally valid concern. And I think, we are all seeking, justice for not only Anna Mae Aquash, but the dozens of people who were also murdered during this reign of terror, and those who are still in prison, paying the consequences for the FBI's refusal to release more information about what it knew and why it hasn't released that information to the general public, right? So I know there's a lot to take in. This, in my, personal sort of experience, this has created a lot of, perspectives of my own of like thinking about when we go out and we hear a certain narrative about, especially about Leonard Peltier. And it's not to say that Leonard Peltier is not a human being and that he did, he may have had bad relations with women. He may have, done things that we may not agree with at a particular point in time, but he's not guilty of the things that he's being accused of. And it's wrong to promote a narrative that is being, even refuted by the DOJ in 1998, or that has been sort of debunked by the FBI's own admission that they knew who killed Anna Mae Aquash in 1975. Or that by this other sort of, revelation that potentially one of the killers was an FBI informant, and that another FBI informant in Denver had reported on another FBI informant. And it raises the other questions around how has the FBI actually changed? How has it reformed itself since, the death of J. Edgar Hoover in 1972, when it came under new direction of, Clarence Kelly and William Webster, but then also how people like James Whitey Bulger, who we know from, who was an FBI informant, or Greg Scarpa Sr., were recruited as top echelon criminal informants for the FBI, yet continued killing people. This was, well into the 90s that this was happening. It's not that the sort of aim period of the FBI was somehow exceptional to the practices of the FBI in other parts, or that with the death of Hoover that the FBI, could sort of regain its legitimacy as a crime-fighting organization. But as a 2004 report by the House of Representatives finally discovered that FBI, quote, decided to use murderers as informants in the 1960s, Known killers were protected from the consequences of their crime and purposely kept on the streets, end quote. And we can see that in the examples of Whitey Bulger and, Greg Scarpa Sr. So we know that the death of Anna Mae Aquash involved at least one FBI informant. The man who told the Denver FBI that Aquash had been murdered. His name, has been known to Denver activists for quite some time, just based on sort of process of elimination. But there's also this other inconvenient question about there's no statute of limitations on murder or, conspiracy to murder. And so is this an attempt to cover up and to hide things that the FBI had knew? It's keeping secrets for a reason. It's not just keeping secrets for, domestic security and all these other things. We can see that even just by what we know in terms of what was revealed through FOIA documents, what was experienced firsthand by a lot of Native women who were used and abused by the FBI, one of whom was Myrtle Poorbear, who was coerced, somebody who suffered mental health issues and developmental issues, was coerced by the FBI to give false testimony. They threatened to take away her children. She gave false testimony against Dick Marshall and the murder of a man named Montalou during that time. But then also she was coerced to give false testimony against Leonard Peltier, which those affidavits claimed that she was not only was she the girlfriend of Leonard Peltier at that time, but also that she had witnessed the shooting and that he was the one who killed these two FBI agents. That was used in the application to extradite him from Canada. So when we think about this question of murdered missing Indigenous women, and I think there's been a lot of internal movement reflection around the role of patriarchy and violence against women, and how that should, we should have zero tolerance for that. And a lot of that comes from the Red Power movement, and like rightfully so. But why is it the organization that's perpetrating the violence against everyone and specifically targeting Native women and Native children, threatening to take children away from Native women if they don't cooperate, threatening to even kill Anna Mae Aquash? According to her own testimony, she was threatened to be killed if she didn't inform on her comrades at the time. This is something she said that Agent Price directly said to her. Remember, Hank Adams said, Anna Mae's ways were Ames' ways, for better or for worse. She was committed to that particular struggle at that particular time. So why is it that we have this phenomenon that's called murdered missing Indigenous women, and we don't look at the very law enforcement agency that has not only neglected investigating, because they're charged with investigating these murders and these abuses against women on Indian reservations, but perhaps was perpetrating violence against Native women at the same time. So this is I want to end it kind of right there to sort of reflect on why is it that Leonard Peltier's freedom poses such a threat to the FBI's narrative of itself and its responsibilities and its roles in this particular moment in time, but also what is the political purpose of keeping somebody like Leonard Peltier behind bars? I would argue, I would sort of editorialize to say that it's because they want to imprison and keep our own history forbidden from us, much like they keep these secrets from us for a long time and have created this really fantastical narrative around AIM leaders creating a conspiracy to murder one of their own. When in fact, I'm not saying that AIM members didn't have a role or a hand in her murder. I'm not claiming that at all. The sources say that the FBI knew by their own admission what had happened. But the scrutiny has never fallen on them to sort of answer for these deeds. And I think we've seen plenty of books like Steve Hendricks' books is pretty scathing when it comes to holding the American Indian movement accountable for potentially, its involvement or its alleged involvement in killing one of its own, but also, these other sort of cases that have happened and not being forthright. But that same scrutiny and that same sort of, those standards have not been held to the FBI. And in fact, it's continuing, as we saw with Standing Rock, continuing to infiltrate movements with their informants and continuing to use Native people and kinship ties to create chaos, division, and paranoia within social movements. So that has not ended whatsoever. And I just wanted to end it there. And I hopefully, if you're a fan of the show, write us, subscribe to Patreon, send us a message on Patreon. If you have questions about this particular case, I'm going to try to create a resource link so that we can refer to it. I also want to bring on some people, maybe have some interviews with people who are actually there during this time period, who had witnessed these events that had happened around the killing of Anna Mae Aquash, but also the continued incarceration of, Leonard Peltier and the persecution of the American Indian movement. And again, this is not something to like absolve AIM. It's not an attempt. It's not, I'm not trying to come out here and say that they're, angels. Like they were very much products of history, right? They were engaged in a liberation struggle. They saw themselves as engaged in a national liberation struggle that sometimes entailed the use of violence. Whether you agree with that or not, those are the facts. And that's what Hank Adams is saying in this particular piece. So as much as we have to be honest about the role of the FBI, we also have to be honest about the American Indian movement and what they hoped to accomplish at that time and the tactics they used. But it's also to say, I would say, just as a caution, that the aim wasn't just about violence. There were so many other things that they were doing at this particular moment in time. They had created survival schools. They were creating community empowerment at a local level. But for whatever reason, we reduce that history to these particular cases of violence, whether it's the shootout in 1975, Wounded Knee, which were all incredibly important for many reasons, the killing of Anna Mae Aquash. But we don't remember the sort of quote unquote nameless heroes of AIM, those who have been killed, whose deaths didn't get the same attention. And didn't get the same sort of scrutiny as I believe, Anna Mae Aquash is rightfully God in that sense. But it also collapses everything that they did into these moments of violence and not really understanding the impact of why the not just the United States, but the FBI would want to create this narrative of AIM as sort of remorseless killers that need to be imprisoned, like the history. There's nothing honorable to recover. It's because for them, even though we are the minority of minorities, they spent so much time and energy to crush that movement, but they weren't able to. It continued on well into the 1980s. It splintered a lot in the 90s, but there's still a legacy of the American Indian movement. And in fact, in Pine Ridge, there's a national holiday on February 27th, February 27th. February 27th is called Liberation Day, for the liberation of Wounded Knee in remembrance of the warriors who fought and died, and also the independent Oglala Nation and the hopes and dreams, not just of the Lakota people, the Oglalas, but also Indigenous people and people worldwide who are fighting for liberation.